Those are bright lights. Well, we have a Minnesota tradition of starting on time, or close to on time. Welcome, everyone. My name is Barbara Fry, and I'm the director of the Human Rights Program here at the University of Minnesota. And on behalf of the organizers of this conference, the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, the Institute for Global Studies, our many co-sponsoring departments and other units at the university, and the funders who have so generously supported this event, I'd like to welcome you to the conference, Truth, Trials, and Memory, an Accounting of Transitional Justice in El Salvador and Guatemala. That title offers some insights into the hopes and expectations for our discussions over the next few days. We will, of course, be examining the primary mechanism of truth commissions, as part of our transitional justice undertaking. And we wish to acknowledge the enormous contributions of two truth commissions that were established 20 and 25 years ago in Guatemala and El Salvador, respectively. Both were innovative in their international nature, making significant contributions to establishing a collective and public truth of the horrendous violations suffered by so many at the hands of state authorities and criminal groups. Innovation also was represented in the trials that took place subsequent to the Truth Commissions, both in the national courts of Guatemala and more recently El Salvador, and through the development of a new international avenue for seeking justice, that of universal jurisdiction. In addition to these mechanisms for truth and justice, we want to consider other cultural and social avenues for addressing the legacies of violence in these two countries. The financial and social reparations, of course, but also the cultural construction of memory. We are pleased to that end to have documentary filmmakers from both El Salvador and Guatemala be able to show their work as an entry point into those discussions. And finally, beyond remembering and explaining the search for transitional justice in El Salvador and Guatemala, we also charge the presenters at this conference with helping us to reconsider these processes in light of what we know now. What truth was told? Whose justice has been served? How has the memory of the past affected the realities of the present in these two precious countries? In a word, we want an accounting of the accountability mechanisms themselves. Now, these seem like lofty goals for a couple of days of conference, but as you can see from the impressive list of presenters who have joined us here, we have the right people in the room to address these questions. Our hope is that in wrestling with the experiences of El Salvador and Guatemala, we will discover insights helpful to the field of human rights and to transitional justice more broadly. When we selected the dates for this conference, the planners realized it was indeed significant that our discussions were timed to coincide with the Day of the Dead, celebrations throughout Central America, today and tomorrow. People in El Salvador and Guatemala at this very moment are gathering and communing with the spirits of the ancestors. They're in the streets, they're in the cemeteries, they have flowers and traditional foods and ornate artistic representations of death itself. We too choose to recognize and honor the dead in our work here. May their suffering not have been in vain. In the words of the introduction of the report of the Commission for Historical Clarification in Guatemala, penned by Christian Tamushat and Otilia Lux de Coty, who are here with us, may the lessons of our work help us to consider, hear, and understand others, and be creative as we find a way to live in peace. So with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce Meredith McQuaid, who is our Associate Vice President and Dean of Global Programs and Strategy Alliance at the University of Minnesota, to offer an official welcome.
Good evening. It is truly a pleasure and an honor to be here this evening to welcome all of you to the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, to the state of Minnesota for some of you, and on behalf of President Kaler and his entire leadership team to the University of Minnesota. I would especially like to welcome tonight's keynote speaker, Professor Pablo de Grief, United Nations Special Rapporteur on the promotion of truth, justice, reparation, and guarantees of non-recurrence. Professors Christian Tamushat and Otilia Lux de Coty, distinguished commissioners of the Commission for Historical Clarification in Guatemala, and of course, to so many jurists, scholars, policymakers, artists, and activists who have been passionate defenders of human rights and justice throughout their careers. We are absolutely delighted, the University of Minnesota, to be the site for this important conference on truth, trials, and memory, and to be recognizing the achievements and accounting for the legacies of processes of justice that have been put into motion over the past quarter of a century. The organizers of this event represent some of the best of who we are here at this large public land-grant institution. The Human Rights Program, an interdisciplinary hub for teaching and research, which began in 2001. The Institute for Global Studies that connects students, scholars, and communities dedicated to social justice, understanding, and transforming our globalized world, formed in 1998. And the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, which was created in 1997, and that means, of course, it shares in the celebration of a 20th anniversary with the Commission for Historical Clarification in Guatemala. These three university programs and the human rights work by so many, both in the Twin Cities where we are now and across the state of Minnesota, have done so much to contribute not only to our collective awareness, but our collective action with respect to human rights. These programs also help us to understand that we still have so much more work to do, including advances in the processes and outcomes related to transitional justice, the focus of this conference. Over the course of the next few days, this conference will see participation by many of the dozens and dozens of faculty from across the 5 campuses that make up the University of Minnesota system. And I want to thank every one of the faculty and staff who have helped to make this event possible, and who have inspired and motivated our undergraduate and graduate students, as well as international scholars from all over the world, to learn, to challenge, and to find ways to stand up for truth and justice at home and abroad. We are also grateful for the broader community of human rights professionals who partner with our faculty and community in doing this work. It is because of the critical work and innovative work of NGOs such as the Center for Victims of Torture and the Advocates for Human Rights, among many others, that Minnesota has a global reputation as one of the most important sites of human rights leadership and activism. I'm also proud to report that we have more university departmental sponsors for this event than we've ever seen before for a human rights program. This level of interest represents both the reputation and the strength of the Human Rights Network here at the university, but also the heightened awareness that we all share. That even while we look back and honor the commitment of people and organizations who demanded transitional justice processes and who were successful in that, we can never, ever assume that this work is done. We must be ever vigilant. We must be ever mindful of the need to honor the past, to learn from it, and to share those lessons with the next generation of teachers, politicians, religious leaders, scholars, artists, scientists, musicians, writers, journalists, entrepreneurs, with the introverts and the extroverts, with the public and the private sector. The University of Minnesota is proud to play a big role in the evolution of young people into these and many other professional and societal roles all over the globe. Your work, your inspiration, your experience in defending human rights is critical to our success and to their future. Thank you so much for being here. Best of luck for an inspiring conference.
Thank you. And now I would like to bring to the stage Kurt Gehring, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Victims of Torture.
Thank you very much, Barb. I have the distinct honor this evening to introduce our keynote speaker, Pablo de Greiff. But before I do that, I just want to take a brief moment to commend the organizers, Barb Fry and the Human Rights Program here at the University of Minnesota, and Alejandro Baer and the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies also here at the university, for organizing this really important and timely conference, Truth, Trials, and Memory. And also to congratulate you for assembling this amazing, this truly amazing, world-class roster of experts who are here. It would be a notable achievement to bring such a distinguished group of individuals together anywhere, but to do this here at this time is truly remarkable. And although you didn't quite fit this in before the snow started to fly, you might have them captive now. This conference is also, I think, a wonderful example of the scope, of the depth, of the collaboration, the collaborative nature of the human rights community here in Minnesota. And in the organization I have the privilege to lead, the Center for Victims of Torture, I experience this every day as we seek to rebuild the lives of survivors of torture. And I'm constantly reminded of the immense human rights expertise and scholarship here, which partners with human rights NGOs in the community in ways that are complementary and which strengthen each other's work to advance human rights protections. And this conference is, I think, an excellent example of that. As many of you know, the concept of transitional justice is a relatively new one. The idea of accountability for human rights crimes was largely unthinkable in modern politics, even after the Nuremberg and Tokyo tribunals. The focus of global politics showed little interest in any kind of accountability, even for the worst atrocities. But things began to change slowly. Things changed with the trials in the mid-1970s in Greece and Portugal, which tried their own state officials for human rights violations during previous authoritarian regimes. Things changed in the mid-1980s when Argentina held its own renowned trials of its top military leaders for their human rights violations in the Dirty War. Things changed with the advent of truth commissions. The first domestic commissions of inquiry began to appear in the mid-1980s. Democratic inquiries, domestic inquiries, carried out by the governments of countries such as Argentina, Uganda, and Uruguay, which had transitioned away from previous repressive regimes. The idea of transitional justice grew out of the experience of these early adopters. And the category of transitional justice is now used to explain different measures used by societies to address legacies of human rights abuses, mass atrocities, and other forms of severe social trauma. And the goal of these measures is to guarantee non-recurrence and to build a more democratic, just, and peaceful future. This conference over the next 2 days will focus on the case studies of transitional justice in 2 countries which have had particular transitional justice experiences with global significance, the Truth Commissions and trials, of course, in El Salvador and Guatemala. And this conference will consider, now with the benefit of 25 years of hindsight, the impacts of these processes, both on the life of the countries themselves and on the broader international community. And to help frame this discussion, we are truly lucky to have one of the foremost global experts on accountability for human rights violations, Pablo de Greiff, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the promotion of truth, justice, reparation, and guarantees of non-recurrence. He has served in that position since his election by the Human Rights Council in 2012. As Special Rapporteur, Mr. de Greiff deals with situations in which there have been widespread violations of human rights and international humanitarian law. He was selected for this important mandate based on the depth of his experience working with different transitional justice bodies across the world. In particular, Pablo de Greiff served as research director for an international NGO called the International Center for Transitional Justice, ICTJ as it's known, from 2001 until 2014, where he was responsible for groundbreaking projects in countries around the world. His writings became reference works in the field, including the Handbook of Reparations, Transitional Justice and Development, Making Connections, and Disarming the Past, Transitional Justice and Ex-Combatants. His work on a holistic or comprehensive conception of transitional justice was foundational for the field as a whole. Mr. de Greiff is both a human rights activist and a scholar. He was born in Bogota and is currently a senior fellow at the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at New York University School of Law. Earlier in his career, de Greiff was a tenured associate professor in the philosophy department at the State University of New York at Buffalo, where he taught ethics and political theory. He was also the Lawrence Rockefeller Fellow at the Center for Human Values at Princeton and held a concurrent fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities. As Special Rapporteur, de Greiff has presented many thematic reports to the United Nations Human Rights Council and to the General Assembly, and carried out 6 country visits to Tunisia, Uruguay, Spain, the UK and Northern Ireland, Burundi, and just last month to Sri Lanka. Please join me now in giving a warm welcome to Pablo de Greiff.
Thank you, Kurt and Vice President McQuaid for the very nice welcome and the very nice introduction. Kurt's very kind introduction is a double-edged sword. After something like that, anything that you might say will be disappointing. So thank you very much. I should also make a small disclaimer. I have taken a cocktail, mind you, not of alcohol, but of cold medication that I hope will not prevent me from being minimally coherent for the next 45 minutes or so. Now let me start by thanking for the very kind invitation. It's really an honor to be here. As has been pointed out repeatedly tonight, Minnesota occupies a very special place in human rights activism precisely for something that I have always been interested in throughout my career, and that is a combination of academic work and practical interests. Transitional justice was something that I was drawn to precisely because it is the meeting place of normative considerations and the very, very harsh realities of a very imperfect world. And that combination between a disciplined research and at the same time practical interests makes Minnesota a unique place and actually a place to be emulated. So thank you to Barbara and Alejandro and all the other organizers for the very, very kind invitation. It is also an honor to be here because I am surrounded by people whose efforts give meaning to my work. And it will be too long to list all of them. But it is because of your efforts that I do what I do. So thank you very much for the inspiration, for the very hard work. And there is still, unfortunately, a lot that needs to be done. And besides being a privilege and an honor, it is also a pleasure because this is like being surrounded by a group of friends. So thank you very much once again. I was asked to try to reflect on what we have learned over the last 20 to 30 years of experience in the transitional justice world. I love the title of trying to come up with an accounting of accountability procedures. I think that this is in many ways long overdue and something that we are not particularly good at, either in the human rights world or more broadly in the human rights world. But let me start on what I take to be accomplishments that the field can in many ways claim credit for, things that have happened with its contributions during the last 20 to 30 years. And I think that we have to start with a very simple fact, and that is that the field managed to consolidate itself. Something that could have not been taken for granted, and since all of you are very familiar with the history of the field, particularly you may recall the very acrimonious debates between truth and justice, which raged on for a very, very long time. When the Secretary General of the UN in 2004 published its report on transitional justice and the rule of law and talked about a holistic, a comprehensive attitude towards transitional justice, one that understood its 4 different pillars: truth, justice, reparations, and guarantees of non-recurrence, as parts of a whole. In other words, as elements that would give support to one another in a broader policy. That in itself was an innovation. For many, many years, the idea that these elements were complementary to one another, that they could reinforce one another, was not at all an idea that had a general consensus. So the field managed to put itself together, as it were, to put under control the centrifugal forces that any field that advocates for a variety of policies always has to face. And this is one that has done it with some degree of success. So now the idea that transitional justice is indeed a holistic policy is perfectly familiar. It is reflected in the ridiculously long title that I have. You know? Who could have ever thought that this was a functional title? But it has, however, the advantage of, because it refers to a single mandate, of illustrating not just the content, but the idea that transitional justice is a policy with 4 elements that are not simply a random collection of initiatives, but that there is something that holds those 4 elements together. Now, in addition to the consolidation of the field, I think that there is a second accomplishment that we ought to acknowledge. And that is that in an extraordinarily short period of time, particularly short by the standards of normative change at the international level, the field managed to normalize itself. The implementation of truth, justice, reparations, and guarantees of non-recurrence is now part of the normal set of expectations that countries that are undergoing different types of transitions are expected not just to discuss and to contemplate, but to implement. So this is now a normal part of the policy tools that countries are expected to implement when they are transitioning, not just from authoritarianism to democracy, but when they are transitioning from conflict into peace. And again, I want to give you the sense that the normalization of the expectations around transitional justice in a 20 to 30 year period in the international domain is a huge accomplishment. And then there are all the other trappings of an autonomous, independent field that one can mention. So this is a field of study. There are people that do masters and PhDs. We educate them. Some of them are here, and the educators reside here among many other places. There is a specialized journal. Ministries of Foreign Affairs devote funds to transitional justice. International cooperation invests in transitional justice. And for those of you interested in the sociology of knowledge, as I am, the marker of the coming of age of an academic field, we have a specialized encyclopedia. So since 2012, with the publication of the Cambridge Encyclopedia of Transitional Justice, the field has its very own encyclopedia. Now, this may sound funny, but in the history of the development of academic disciplines, this is really a marker of the increased autonomy of an academic field. And now we have that. Now, much more important than all of this is the set of accomplishments in the real world to which transitional justice has contributed. I think that transitional justice has contributed to an unpacking of the notion of accountability so that it is understood not just in terms of criminal accountability, as classical human rights work in many ways was forced to do, but also to include, again, as complementary measures, a right to truth, a right to reparation, and a right to non-recurrence. And I think that transitional justice has helped tremendously to the entrenchment of those rights, both at the international level and at the national level. And this has been a question not just of textual or doctrinal progress. Transitional justice has contributed crucially to the operationalization of those rights. It has contributed crucially to the operationalization of the right to truth through the establishment of truth commissions, amongst others, truth-telling and truth-seeking mechanisms. It has contributed immensely to the entrenchment and the operationalization of the right to reparation through the establishment of administrative reparations programs that have served, of course, with all sorts of deficiencies, but that nevertheless have served to, among other things, convince people whose rights have been violated that they are nevertheless rights holders by the tens of thousands in different parts of the world. Transitional justice has contributed to the entrenchment of a right to justice, to redress, through, among other things, the development of prosecutorial strategies. So on each of the pillars of a comprehensive transitional justice measures, I think that there is a lot that transitional justice can claim as a success, as an accomplishment. And this is one of the reasons why we are here, why all of us are here discussing the notion of transitional justice, something that 20 years ago would have been very unlikely to gather a group of this sort. So I think that there is quite a bit to celebrate. But going back to the invitation to think about what we have learned, and particularly going back to the invitation to think about providing an accounting of accountability procedures. Of course, I don't think that everything is rosy. We have learned some very tough measures. Let me describe succinctly two different ways of putting the general point I would like to make in the next part of my intervention. There is a sense in which we have learned that doing transitional justice is much more difficult than we thought originally it was going to be. A less charitable way of putting the point is to say that we have become increasingly aware of how bad lawyers are at policy making. Or, to offer yet another description of the point, I think that the human rights community, in which, of course, I include myself, we are lousy at describing how to get from here to there. We are very good at describing desirable end states, describing our obligations, but we are not particularly good at describing the pathway that would get us from the very messy reality that we confront today to the realization of the normative ideal that moves a good part of our work. And I think that those deficiencies, the fact that we are not particularly good at policy, that we are very interested in the description of the end states, and that lawyers, for the most part, are not very well attuned to the difficulties of drawing policies, actionable policies, are at the heart of some of the difficulties and the challenges that the field faces today. I am, of course, abstracting from a set of challenges that have a lot to do with the trends at the geopolitical level, by comparison to which what I just mentioned is merely an internal problem, a problem with our self-understanding and the way that we do things. The geopolitical problems, which I don't think that we can ignore, but that include, for example, great selectivity, or what is usually called double standards, in the implementation of human rights norms, of course, makes transitional justice work significantly more difficult. So I cannot tell you how many times I am told when I visit countries that the US tortured prisoners in Guantanamo and in Iraq. What are you doing talking to us about the absolute prohibition against torture? And of course, the US is not the only superpower that has problems of this sort. There is quite a close correlation between geopolitical power and the shielding of oneself with respect to human rights claims that it would be totally naive, at the very least, not to mention. Similarly, it would be naive not to mention a second trend geopolitically that makes transitional justice and human rights work in general much more difficult, and that is a trend towards securitization, the definition of which is, of course, taking as an existential threat any sort of risk, and therefore justifying extraordinary measures in response to that existential threat. So the securitization of all sorts of discussions, of course, makes the notion of accountability, both ex ante and ex post, much more difficult. And thirdly, I think that it would be naive not to mention something that has a direct bearing on transitional justice work, which is the closing all over the world of civil spaces. I have never met a government that has spontaneously, out of its own volition, adopted an aggressive transitional justice policy. Governments are brought to this out of popular demand. And if you squelch the space in which those demands can be expressed, you consequently hurt the field. And this is happening all over the world. So leaving aside those trends and coming back to things over which we have some control, let me mention then some of the lessons that I think would be relevant for an accounting of accountability measures. This is a field that perhaps because of the fact that it is a multi-layered one, that inherently encapsulates a defense and the promotion of different policies, perhaps because of its roots in human rights work, which makes us very prone to think that given that the cause is good, that's all that matters, and we do not have to worry too much about the details. It is sometimes very undisciplined. It is a field that, for example, has a great deal of difficulties in defining its very ends. What is it that we are trying to accomplish in doing transitional justice? And particularly, what are the most conducive means for the achievement of those ends? So the field is still characterized by huge debates, fundamental debates about all of these issues. And this translates into a certain type of undiscipline with respect to the framing of the mandates of the institutions that are supposed to embody transitional justice ideals. So if one were to examine, as I had to do in writing a report on this topic for the Human Rights Council, the different reports of human rights commissions, which of course I had read in different parts of my professional career, but for the writing of this report, I read all of them, not in a single sitting, but in the same period. And then some trends emerge very clearly. And let me summarize those trends. So the very same type of institution, namely ad hoc, temporary, not part of any broad institutional framework, without a well-settled bureaucracy. In other words, all the markings of a politically weak institution, one with a great degree of moral suasion, but with very, very little real political clout. The very same type of institution has grown in functions and in obligations along many different dimensions. And I would like to focus particularly on the following. The thematic mandate of commissions has expanded tremendously. So the CONADEP in Argentina, for instance, the mandate of that commission was very narrowly defined. It was supposed to investigate cases of disappearance, which it understood very narrowly, namely in terms of kidnappings that were unresolved and the bodies were never found. That was the starting point of what we may call the Contemporary Truth Commission. If you compare that with the thematic mandate of the Kenyan Commission, then you get a very good impression of how far the field has traveled. So from a mandate that mentioned only disappearances, you get to a mandate that authorizes and obligates the Kenyan Commission to investigate and to explain, to account for a significantly broader set of violations, not just the typical violations of civil and political rights, but also violations of social, economic, and cultural rights, and not just to engage in exercises of fact-finding, of clarifying the immediate facts around the violations, but to provide an account of all the surrounding circumstances that may have led to the violations of this increasingly large catalog of violations. So the very notion of fact-finding, which was integral to the idea of a truth commission, has become significantly more complex over time. Now, the second trend in the establishment of mandates of truth commissions that I will use as an illustration of my main point, namely that there has been an expansion of the mandates, and one that hasn't always obeyed very, very good, sound reasons, is that the functions of truth commissions have expanded as well. So from the very idea of fact-finding and to some extent victim tracing, which were the core two functions of the original truth commissions, one has to remember that the CONADEP report had a single page on recommendations on reparations, and a couple of pages on recommendations about institutional reforms. And furthermore, that these were not described in the mandate that established the Commission. I am convinced that the authors of the report included these reparative recommendations and these preventive suggestions, because it is very difficult to listen to so much pain without giving back something in return, without making any sort of recommendation, just recording it. Over time, truth commissions solidly incorporated not just the fact-finding and victim tracing functions, they solidly incorporated a reparative function and a function having to do with prevention. And therefore, we get the very, very complex, and in most cases, very useful recommendations about institutional reforms that different truth commissions have given. But in addition to that expansion already of the functions, there is more. So truth commissions are now, for example, expected to contribute to processes of national and sometimes even of personal reconciliation. The Tunisian Truth Commission additionally expected the Commission to settle questions about corruption, not just to investigate, but to arbitrate and to settle disputes having to do with corruption. So the point is, there is a huge growth in the function and not just in the themes that truth commissions are expected to cover. And the question is whether the truth commissions can bear that increasing load. I will postpone my answer to that question for a second. There is one more trend that I think we ought to keep in mind in the field, not just with respect to truth commissions, and that is what some economists and organizational sociologists call isomorphic mimicry, the tendency to replicate institutional forms regardless of context and regardless of their possibility of satisfying the needs for which they were presumably set up. Let me use an example, not in the transitional justice field, to illustrate what isomorphic mimicry looks like in the real world, and that is the fate of anti-corruption commissions. Anti-corruption commissions, once they were designed, were copied throughout the world, regardless of any consideration of whether that particular institutional form was going to be good enough to tackle the specific challenges in corruption in completely different settings. In settings, for example, in which societies were still organized around the notion of kinship, and in which, therefore, corruption looks very, very different from what it would look like in Norway and Denmark and even the US. But exactly the same model was copied from one place to another. The transitional justice field has suffered exactly the same fate. We are often engaged in what I think are instances of isomorphic mimicry. I paid a recent visit to the Gambia, which is thinking about establishing a truth commission. And in a council of ministers, I asked them, so why are you thinking about establishing a truth commission? Not because I was skeptical. Mind you, I think that the Gambia is a very good country in which to establish a truth commission. And they looked at one another and they said, isn't that what we're supposed to do? And again, this is an example of this. In the texts of truth commissions, once you read them together, you get absolutely horrifying examples of cutting and pasting. Exactly the same expressions being used in one mandate versus another, as if someone without any sort of care had really cut and pasted segments from one mandate to another. And I think that this is a very serious problem, because of course one of the consequences that we pay is that we become much less attentive to context. And this is a third trend that I would like to insist upon as a major challenge that the field faces. One very simple way of telling the story of the development of the paradigm of transitional justice is to say that it emerged in the Latin American countries of the Southern Cone, traveled very rapidly to the Central and Eastern European countries, then to South Africa, and after South Africa, it disseminated very broadly and rapidly to all sorts of contexts. There are all sorts of imperfections with this story, one of which, of course, I will come back because it is perfectly relevant to this context. But following that simple story, one can say that despite all the differences between those sets of countries that I just mentioned, they shared two things that were very important. First, all of them were highly institutionalized countries. They were highly institutionalized both vertically and horizontally. The institutions of the state had the capacity to make themselves present in every corner of the state's territory. And vertically, these were countries without huge legal vacuums. All the important spheres of interaction between citizens and the institutions of the state were already regulated by means of law, which of course doesn't mean that they were well regulated or that the laws were wise or even that they were effectively enforced. But again, it was a question of capacity. The second important characteristic that they shared is that those were countries which were trying to redress, not surprisingly, a type of human rights violation that related to the institutional capacities of the state. In other words, transitional justice was designed as a policy to redress the abusive exercise of state power, which requires very, very high institutional capacities. Now, once you move from that set of countries and move into the weakly institutionalized post-conflict contexts, you are, of course, in an entirely different world. And you are in an entirely different world along those two dimensions. You are talking about countries that are not highly institutionalized, either vertically or horizontally. And you are talking about countries that need to redress a list of violations that looks very different from the list of violations that the authoritarian regimes of the Latin American Southern Cone were responsible for. So the sorts of violations that take place in the DRC or in Mali or in the Central African Republic, for example, are not the same sort of violations that took place in Santiago and in Buenos Aires. You are really talking about a different world. Now, all the transitional justice measures that are part of the paradigm are measures that presuppose a fairly high degree of institutionalization and that presuppose violations of a certain type. The huge asymmetry in the violations in the authoritarian regimes, for example, of course, made plausible the work of truth commissions. It greatly aided the disclosure of the violence that took place. It made feasible the attribution of responsibility, criminal and non-criminal responsibility. And of course, the strong institutions of those states made it feasible for large-scale reparations programs to be established. So being inattentive to context, I think, has led to one of the elements of an accounting of accountability that I think that we have to be much more mindful for. Now, I said before that this was a very imperfect way of telling the story. And one of its many imperfections has to do with the fact that, of course, it omits reference to Guatemala and El Salvador, cases that come precisely in between the Argentinian and Chilean cases and the Central and Eastern European transitions, and that in fact have many resemblances with the post-conflict cases that we now find so difficult to grapple with. So I think that it is perfectly timely now, in retrospect, to go back to two very important early transitional justice cases, which were not exactly like the post-authoritarian cases of the Latin American Southern Cone, from which I think we should have derived the lessons that we didn't, because we were too insensitive to contextual features. And I think that this is something that we ought to overcome. I will want to make only 2 points, which I will not argue for extensively because we are running out of time and it would be nice to have a conversation, so I will finish with this. I think in an accounting of accountability measures, I think that we ought to include, from my perspective, the fact that for many different reasons, including processes of professionalization to which all of us contribute, which, by the way, of course, are partly responsible for the fact that we do so much mimicry. This is what processes of accreditation risk leading to. But one of the things that we ought to watch for is the overemphasis on institutional work exclusively. I think that there are very good reasons from a human rights perspective to pay a lot of attention to the institutional dimension of transitional justice work. But I want to say that transitional justice is not simply a matter of clever institutional engineering, that sustainable social change requires work also in the domain of culture and in the domain of personal dispositions and beliefs. That omitting those would be akin to thinking that, for example, the problem of racism in this country could be solved through the criminalization of hate crime alone. And while I think that outlawing different manifestations of racism is important. Without simultaneous changes in culture and in personal habits, I think it would be very difficult to do away with racism. Similarly, the success of transitional justice, of the Transitional Justice Project, I do not think should be thought of simply in terms of institutional engineering. And the final point, and this taking advantage of the fact that I am giving this talk in a setting that combines both practical interests and academic interests, is that all human rights work and transitional justice work, perhaps particularly but not exclusively, is facing a daunting challenge with respect to accounting for its own impact, describing the way in which it makes a difference. Under the pressure of many different factors, including a turn towards results orientation in the international donor community, changes, very significant changes in the philanthropic world towards entrepreneurial philanthropy that is very interested in results. For many different reasons, there is no field that depends on international cooperation that will be able to survive for long without giving an account of the difference it makes. And coupled to our lack of interest and competence in doing policy is the very serious problem that we have a very dim idea of how to account for our impact. And this is one area in which better integration between academic research and practical interests would do the field a great deal. Because this is not a question of finding a more efficient way of counting beans. I am convinced that this is a question of finding a better way of explaining why what we do is important, the processes that it obeys, and the time horizons that are needed in order for the field to show its work. And here again, a meeting that takes place 25 years after very important experiments in the continent, which did so much for the development of the field, I think is a great opportunity and a great chance. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I think this is set. Am I good? Well, Pablo, I just want to say thank you so much. Those of you in the audience might not know this, but Pablo's a little under the weather. And so I just said to my seatmate, I wonder what he's like when he's not sick. So thank you so much for that really incredibly thoughtful and important framing of the topic that we're looking at, of taking us to the whole field. And so you didn't give a lot of case examples because we know that there's probably some diplomacy involved in that kind of thing. But I'm wondering if you could talk about, I know that your latest report is really on this issue of regimes that don't have the institutional support, the post-authoritarian regimes that really are suffering in terms of institutions and of the capacity to make differences. And I'm wondering if, whether through examples or not, you could elaborate a little bit on what kind of recommendations that you would make in those cases where there aren't adequate judges or courts, that the country, the biggest problems are not trials, they're getting reparations to people, allowing people to actually find their loved ones. And I'm just wondering if there are some kind of practical lessons that you're learning from those experiences you can tell us about.
So, thank you, Barbara. I think that this is a very serious challenge that both the transitional justice world in general and the human rights world without limits has to face. In the preparation for this last report to the Human Rights Council, I did some rough calculations of the government income per capita of different countries at the point of transition. And that we have to understand that this is not transitional justice is not an abstraction. So when Chile had its transition, the government income per capita was more than $500. When Liberia had its transition, the government income per capita was $20 to $30. In 2008, the Afghani government's income per capita was $8. So let's understand what this means. That there is a government that has $8 per citizen to do everything that it is supposed to do. Debt repayment, education, health, infrastructure, and education, and the provision of justice. So, of course, it matters that you have $560 per capita rather than $8. The horizon of possibilities is completely different. And I think that there is a peculiar form of cruelty in awakening the expectations of victims when you have no reason to believe that you will be able to satisfy those expectations. Now, the message that I want to send with considerations of this sort is, of course, not that justice is a luxury that only the affluent can afford. It is, in the first place, a call to the international community. Look, you keep talking about the importance of justice regimes, and yet these tremendous inequalities between cases are allowed to continue, and not merely allowed to continue, but in some cases provoked by the inequalities are provoked by the international community itself. Secondly, I wanted to send a message about what is it that we can do concretely and in the short run, because I do not want to tell countries like the DRC and CAR and Mali and some of the very complicated cases that we are dealing with today, come back in 15 years when your institutions are stronger. I think that this would be absurd. But so what is it that we can do particularly for the victims in countries like that? Again, I think that promising that we will do in those countries everything that we have done in countries with an entirely different horizons of possibility in the short run should be a non-starter. It's a form of deceit. I think that we have to work much more effectively on strengthening a civil society in cases in which institutions are weak or captured or affected by chronic forms of corruption, and generally in some places just totally non-existent. I think that it is very important in those cases particularly to work on strengthening civil society. Secondly, I think that there may be a case for establishing a sort of prioritization strategy across the board. In many ways, to learn lessons from our colleagues in the humanitarian world who have had some huge successes in dealing with the immediate needs of very, very large populations. And in that way, I think that we should try to unleash processes that over time lead to a fuller realization of rights. So for example, if there's a country that cannot at any given point in time establish a full-fledged reparation program, establishing victims assistance programs to deal with the most urgent cases of need and vulnerability, reserving the use of the term reparations for something that counts as such may not be an unjustified strategy. Similarly, in the face of the huge expansion of the function of truth commissions, absent any sort of functional analysis that would tell us that these institutions that we are creating are fit to purpose, that they can actually accomplish the goals that we are attributing to them. I do not think that going back to some of the fundamentals would be such a bad thing. Do much more effective fact-finding, do much more effective victim tracing, provide an account of the situations of violence that do not go back 500 years in history, but that concentrate on the immediate factors of the case, and that contain actionable recommendations. I do not think that that would be a bad strategy.
I'm going to, we have a couple questions directed more specifically to the cases that we're going to discuss. So I'd like to engage you in these couple of questions. One is just how does your analysis relate to specifically the Truth Commission in Guatemala? And then similarly, looking at the present, how can this paradigm work on countries like El Salvador and Guatemala today to address threats posed by gangs and organized crime and the state's relationship to organized crime? So I guess in some ways looking at specifically at the Commission's impacts and strategies that they used, and then bringing us to today's Salvador and Guatemala, whether transitional justice processes or paradigms are a useful way to think about those situations.
So, a small parenthetical remark and then an indirect answer to the question. I have made visit requests to both governments, and therefore I will not say too much specifically about either case, because I am still hopeful that at least one of them will accept the visit, and therefore it would be akin to prejudging a case. But let me address the issue in the following sense. I think that the sensitivity to context that I was talking about in part of my intervention is important, generally speaking, but now with the passage of time, particularly important. There is always a threat with the passage of time. And this is something that can be learned from many different experiences. The longer the gap between discussion and implementation, for example, between reports and the implementation of recommendations, the greater the risk that the discussions become entangled in partisan political contestation. And there is always a danger for transitional justice in being seen as an instrument of turn-taking. Nothing undermines more the effectiveness of transitional justice than it being seen as a way of favoring one constituency over another. This is, after all, a question of fundamental rights, not a question of partisan politics. But the passage of time always raises questions about why now? Why are we doing this now? Which are prone to be given a response in the key of partisan politics. So this is one risk to be aware of. There are, of course, also advantages to the passage of time. A transitional period is one that is pregnant with the possibilities, but at the same time fraught with the difficulties and constraints. And tackling some of these issues after a lot of time has passed, after, for example, institutions have grown stronger, after some individuals have lost their influence. There are no universal laws in this field, but there is a useful rule of thumb which says that a retired general is easier to prosecute than an acting general. And therefore, the passage of time, which allows for processes of personal renovation, for example, also open up possibilities. And therefore, I think that it is very interesting to use, to make the best of the anniversaries that are coming up with the reports, to reopen some of the discussions that are still pending, not just from that time, but because of issues that have emerged since then, some of which arguably have some linkages with unredressed violations in the past. But I think that we need to be a bit more imaginative than, for example, think about the replication of a new commission just as a mechanical exercise. The general question that I would always like to pose is the same one that I posed in the Gambia. Why do you think that establishing a truth commission is a good idea under these particular circumstances? When violence and terror were exercised in silence and in secrecy, and when there was one major actor that was responsible for the bulk of violence, the rationale for a body like a truth commission is perfectly apparent. When violence is exercised in total openness, no one is trying to hide anything. And instead of one state agent responsible for the majority of the violations, you have 15 different agents of violence with a lot of circulation between them, with very thin lines between civilians and participants. I think that there is a legitimate question of whether a truth commission is the best vehicle for finding out and understanding what happened in those circumstances.
Something that we're facing in many different contexts.
Absolutely.
And so your suggestion of not cutting and pasting into those contexts is very, very helpful.
I think that remembering what is it that we are trying to accomplish in the field, no? And going back to the fundamentals about the promotion of certain types of rights, the right to redress, to accountability, to truth, to reparation, and to non-repetition, is much more fundamental than the idea of replicating institutional forms that have been used in the past in order to give content and institutional expression to those rights. So in each situation, we ought to say the fundamental commitment is to the promotion of those 4 types of rights. And what are the best mechanisms to accomplish that goal? And I don't think that we do enough of that, to be perfectly honest. And again, I am not talking about the field as an external observer. I include myself in this. I have educated the people. I have taught courses. I have gone to countries and have asked, like in Burundi, what are you thinking about a reparations program for victims? And I was told, look, during 2014, total foreign direct investment in Burundi was $8 million, which I am sure is less than the income of a Starbucks in Minneapolis. What are you asking? What are you talking about when the universe of potential beneficiaries is in the hundreds of thousands, and if not millions? And the total direct investment in the country was $8 million during the last year. So I think that we ought to be much more imaginative and creative about the way that we do these things, and to think always, what's the end and what is a functional way of achieving those ends.
So let's move from looking at the least institutional countries to the most institutional countries. And let's look at the global north and places like the United States and Western Europe. And from two perspectives, questions are arising. One is, what positive things can those states do in regard to transitional justice without being perceived as colonialist intervention? But then let's turn that on its head and say, why don't those countries tend to have transitional justice institutions for some of their violations? Is there more resistance in more powerful states to this notion of accountability? And finally, what about the charges of neocolonialism in the kind of transitional justice work that we do? Is transitional justice just another form of imposing our expectations on the global south?
Yeah, let me start with the latter. And here I have to confess philosophical predispositions and predilections. I am a total Kantian universalist. I would be very, very happy to argue the case, but I don't think that this is the right context to do it. In any case, I am a strong believer in the universality of rights. Everyone that I interact with in the victims community in countries that I travel to are wanting to get more of these measures rather than less. And while I am a total advocate for the sort of sensitivity to context that I have been arguing for, that is, of course, totally compatible, and I take it to be part and parcel of a legitimate implementation of universally valid norms. So, I mean, of course, everything can be done in a heavy-handed way. There are extremes of insensitivity to context that can border on lack of respect, but that there are some good and legitimate grounds for realizing rights to truth, justice, reparations, and guarantees of non-recurrence, which is totally the opposite of the claim that this is a neocolonialist agenda. Again, I would be very happy to argue for both practically and philosophically. On the first set of questions, I am on record in saying that I found it totally appalling that the United States said, for example, very shortly after former President Obama was elected, that it was not going to engage in prosecuting well-documented cases of torture, including the authorization of torture, because the new administration didn't want to be perceived to be engaged in a witch hunt. I found that totally appalling. That the United States representative in Geneva, when the Universal Periodic Review of the US took place, said that there was no need for the United States to establish a reparations program for victims, because after all, US courts were permanently available for victims to raise claims. I found it the height of hypocrisy when actively, in every possible way, the government was engaged in acts that constituted the denial of access to U.S. courts to victims. So I think that there is absolutely no way of accounting for this. There is, of course, the usual antipathy towards being told you did wrong. But I think that there is a sense in which I think it would be very, very good for all of us to internalize the idea, the very old-fashioned idea, that opportunities entail responsibilities. It was very important for me, given that the mandate was new, to send a message to the international community that these were problems that were very well distributed, not just problems that afflicted the global south. And hence, in the list of countries that I visited, that includes Spain and the UK, both because the cases merited the visits by themselves, but also to send the message that these are problems that afflict countries regardless of, for example, degrees of socioeconomic development or legal tradition or geographical location. I think that this is very important for all of us to understand. Now, higher degrees of institutionalization and lower levels of risk, I think, entail particular responsibilities. There was no risk, comparatively speaking, in the US more aggressively pursuing accountability in different forms for the violations that took place and that in many ways still are taking place in Guantanamo and that took place in detention centers in different parts of the world. Countries that faced much higher risks about political and institutional continuity, for example, were willing to take the leap, and they did the right thing. Countries that face no risk, like arguably the US did, have a particular obligation to practice what they preach.
I think you found agreement. Let's close on a question that moves us in a slightly different direction. You mentioned the importance of changes to culture and personal beliefs, and wondering if you could highlight, and have you seen in your work some particularly helpful examples of efforts to make cultural change, either through artistic practices or other forms of cultural reconciliation?
I think that this is really a totally underexplored area that deserves much more attention. Keep in mind, of course, that neither a culture nor individual dispositions are the subjects of policymaking in the same way that institutions are. Functionally speaking, both culture and personal dispositions are supposed to provide continuity and stability, which means that they are less resistant to direct intervention than institutions, which are supposed to be responsive to everyday needs. But of course, that doesn't mean that they are totally immutable. We know that there are cultural transformations, some of them quite profound. The success, for example, in the transformation of attitudes and in the culture concerning gay rights, for example, I think is a fabulous recent achievement of the sort of thing that we are talking about. This is something that we saw in the recent past in front of our eyes. So anyone who wonders what does the transformation of culture and of personal disposition looks like should be told, think about what we just went through with respect to these sets of issues. I happen to think that art is extraordinarily important in achieving transformations of this sort. that the photography exhibit that accompanied the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Peru, for example, was extraordinarily influential and something that's very important. That documentaries of the sort that Paco and Pam work on, and many others here, that these are crucial instruments for the transformation of attitudes. That literature, for example, can provide insights, particularly into the long-term spillover intergenerational effects of violence, that it is very, very difficult to capture in a report, no matter how carefully it is done. And that there are great examples of that sort of work, both in the distant past and in the recent past. Aramburu's Patria, the novel in Spain that won the Nobel Prize this year, about the period of ETA, for example, which I read just last week. It's a wonderful example, precisely, of this sort of accounting of the spillover effects of violence, the way that loyalties are deployed in different discussions, the way that lines are drawn between communities, but also of the way that those lines can be redrawn in different places. So I think I am totally supportive of significantly more work in the domain of culture and in the domain of personal dispositions, including, for instance, in the realm of education, a hugely underutilized instrument for human rights defenders, although very, very well utilized by people who are interested in sowing discord and violence. So there's still a lot of possibilities that we can explore, and it is good to end on a positive note. So go for it.
Well, Pablo de Greve, thank you so much for